Ukraine in particular has suffered from this sort of all-out aerial assault. And as the situation on the ground becomes more static, the battle for the skies becomes more intense. So one of the main things that Ukraine has been consistently asking for is superior Western air defenses.
Britain will donate manned aircraft to Ukraine for the first time since the beginning of the war. The Defence Secretary made the announcement from the HMS Queen Elizabeth, currently anchored in Oslo and set to depart for military drills with NATO allies. George Grylls is political reporter for The Times and has been covering this story. Morning, George.
Good morning.
What's the significance of this? Manned aircraft to Ukraine, does that come closer to the idea of British service people near or on the ground?
I don't think so, but it's certainly a symbolic step up in military aid. So if you think there's always been this hard red line in our lethal aid to Ukraine, which is about fighter jets and aircraft. Now, we've supplied drones, we've supplied surface-to-air missiles, but we haven't so far supplied manned aircraft. So this is the first time a piloted aircraft is being given to Ukraine, and that comes in the form of 3 Sea King helicopters.
And what will they do? What will they do in Ukraine, these helicopters?
Well, they have been used usually for search and rescue, for reconnaissance. They're not usually fitted with sort of weapons themselves. They're more for sort of, helping out spot targets and, bringing back people from the battlefield. But that's not to say the Ukrainians might not sort of creatively use them in their own way.
Is there concern, I don't know if you've heard this discussed in the MOD, concern about them being shot down and therefore the people in them being put at risk?
I think there's always concern. Let's not forget that for the past month or two, Ukraine in particular has suffered from this sort of all-out aerial assault. And as the situation on the ground becomes more static, the battle for the skies becomes more intense. So one of the main things that Ukraine has been consistently asking for is superior Western air defenses. And the incident in Poland last week illustrated the fact that they are relying increasingly on these sort of dodgy Soviet-era missiles that are liable to go wrong.
Are you getting a sense from the MOD, George, that there is they always talk about their unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine? This is, as you say, a step up. Are all the noises in that direction that there's going to be more and more support for Ukraine over the next 6 months to a year as the war potentially even enters its final stages?
From Britain, yes, but there were question marks when the Americans, Mark Milley, last week, who's head of the US Army, he was saying that perhaps is now the time for Ukraine to start negotiations because they've been negotiating from a position of strength. Now that sort of undermined the sort of Western line. Since then, there's been a bit of rowing back from Washington, but it was interesting for that opinion to be voiced publicly. From the UK, I haven't heard that argument being made yet, but for the US to make it was certainly an interesting moment.
Yeah, and just finally, do you get a sense of where the money for this comes from? Because Ben Wallace didn't get a monetary injection for his department he would have wanted in last week's budget. The idea of the 3% GDP thing seems to have gone by the wayside. Will this be classed as aid rather than military expenditure, or is that at all clear at this point?
This particular package of lethal aid will be okay because essentially these Sea Kings are no longer used by the Royal Navy, so they're just sitting in a warehouse somewhere, so they might as well be given to Ukraine and trained on them. But in general, the lethal aid, I think the MOD is hoping it can be used from Treasury contingency funds, so it doesn't actually impact the MOD budget. The Treasury seems to have made that promise. Whether it follows through, I think we're yet to find out, and that's going to come more when all the defence spending is announced in the new year.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Because lots of promises were made in different economic circumstances, and whether the promises then get moved away from is an interesting question. George, good to speak to you as ever. Thanks for joining us. That's George Grylls, our political reporter for The Times, covering the story of Britain sending manned helicopters to Ukraine for the first time.